I've always been a quiet man, a solitary one. I live in a small, modest house at the edge of town, and for years my life was peaceful, predictable, until the Crutchfields moved in next door. The Crutchfields were the sort of neighbors that disrupted the serenity of an entire street. Mrs. Crutchfield, a bony woman with a face like a crumpled newspaper, had a voice that could curdle milk. She spent her days shouting at her husband, her dog, the postman, and, on occasion, me. Mr. Crutchfield, on the other hand, was a lumbering, dim-witted sort who rarely spoke, though his actions were loud enough. His favorite pastime seemed to be mowing the lawn at dawn or hammering away at unseen projects well into the night. It was Mrs. Crutchfield who caused the most trouble, though. She took to snooping around my garden, plucking my roses without asking, and, on one memorable occasion, letting her mangy little dog relieve itself on my prized vegetable patch. When I confronted her, she smirked and said, "Oh, don't be so precious. They're just vegetables." That was the day I decided enough was enough. It began as a small, flickering idea, like the pilot light of a stove. I didn't mean for it to grow into a roaring flame. But, you see, Mrs. Crutchfield didn't just pluck my roses or insult my vegetables. She trespassed into my peace of mind. She disrupted the rhythm of my days, the silence I cherished, and I couldn't stand it any longer. The plan was simple, ridiculously so. Mrs. Crutchfield had a weakness for gossip and baked goods, and I happened to be an excellent baker. One afternoon, I knocked on her door with a tray of lemon scones, her favorite, as I'd overheard her mention to a friend. She invited me in, her beady eyes glinting with suspicion, but the promise of sweets softened her. We sat in her stuffy living room, and I listened to her prattle on about the other neighbors while she stuffed scone after scone into her mouth. It wasn't long before she began to look pale. Her words slurred, her eyes glazed over, and soon enough she slumped over in her chair, lifeless as a marionette with its strings cut. I won't bore you with the details of what came next. Suffice it to say, I'd prepared well. My years of gardening had taught me the importance of sharp tools and steady hands. Mrs. Crutchfield, unpleasant as she was, proved quite useful in death. Her flesh was surprisingly tender, and her stringy frame yielded enough meat for several hearty meals. I decided the pièce de résistance would be a shepherd's pie, comforting, unassuming, and oh so delicious. I packed it neatly into a dish and brought it over to Mr. Crutchfield the following afternoon. "Thought you could use a warm meal," I said, my voice brimming with false cheer. "You've been working so hard out in the garden." He looked at me, dumb as ever, and took the dish with a grateful grunt. That evening I watched through my kitchen window as he devoured the pie with gusto, his fork scraping the edges of the dish. He even licked the spoon clean. For a few days, life was blissfully quiet. I almost regretted what I'd done, not because I felt guilt, I didn't, but because the tranquility made me realize just how much I'd endured. I could hear birdsong again, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of the world turning. But peace is a fragile thing. A week later, there was a knock at my door. It was Mr. Crutchfield. His face, usually blank and slack-jawed, wore an expression I couldn't quite place. Hunger? Curiosity? Something darker? "That pie," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Best I ever had. You got any more?" I felt a chill skitter down my spine. "No," I said, forcing a tight smile. "That was a one-time thing." He didn't leave. He just stood there, staring at me with those dull, greedy eyes. And then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Shame. Tasted just like my wife." He smiled then, a slow, knowing grin, and shuffled back to his house. I haven't slept since. At night I hear sounds from his garden. Digging, scraping. Once I thought I heard him humming a tune. It was cheerful, almost jaunty, but beneath it there was a crackling, broken quality, like a record warped by heat. I've decided to move, somewhere far away, somewhere quiet. But as I write this, I hear footsteps on my porch, a knock at the door, and the smell of shepherd's pie wafts through the air.